The alarm clock buzzed at 4:30 a.m., just like it had every morning for the past 3 years. Keisha rolled over and hit the snooze button, her body aching from the double shift she had worked the day before. The tiny apartment was quiet, except for the soft breathing of her 3 children sleeping in the next room. She knew she had exactly 10 minutes before the baby would wake up crying for his morning bottle. As she stumbled to the kitchen, reality hit her like a cold splash of water. The refrigerator was almost empty, and worse yet, there was no formula left for baby David. She had used the last scoop the night before, mixing it with a little extra water to make it stretch. Her heart sank as she remembered checking her bank account on her phone the previous evening. After paying rent and utilities, she had exactly $12 left until her next paycheck on Friday. Today was only Tuesday. Keisha opened the cabinet where she kept the children's breakfast supplies. A half-empty box of generic cereal and some crackers stared back at her. Her 8-year-old daughter Lisa would understand if breakfast was just cereal again, and 6-year-old Tommy never complained about anything. But the baby needed his formula, and there was no way to explain to a 10-month-old why there wasn't any food. She sat down at the small kitchen table and put her head in her hands. How had things gotten this bad? 3 years ago, when David's father left, she thought she could manage everything on her own. She had been working as a cleaning lady at the downtown office building, and the pay wasn't great, but it was steady. Then the building changed management companies, and her hours got cut from full-time to part-time. She picked up a second job cleaning houses on weekends, but even working 7 days a week, she could barely keep up with the bills. The sound of David crying from the bedroom broke her thoughts. She went to pick him up, his little face red and angry from hunger. She tried giving him some water in his bottle, but he pushed it away and cried harder. Lisa appeared in the doorway, her school uniform wrinkled from sleeping in it because Keisha hadn't had time to do laundry. "Mama, is David okay?" Lisa asked, rubbing her eyes. "He's just hungry, baby. Go get ready for school," Keisha said, trying to keep her voice steady. Lisa was smart for her age, maybe too smart. She looked at her mother with those knowing eyes that made Keisha's heart break a little more each day. "Is there any cereal left for breakfast?" "Of course there is. Don't worry about anything, okay? Just get yourself and Tommy ready." As Lisa walked back to the bedroom, Keisha knew she was running out of options. She had already called her mother, but her mom was barely making ends meet on Social Security. Her sister had helped out a few times, but she had her own family to worry about. The local food bank was only open on Thursdays, and even then, they didn't always have baby formula. She had applied for government assistance weeks ago, but the paperwork seemed endless, and she kept getting told she needed more documentation. Every time she took time off work to go to the assistance office, she lost money she couldn't afford to lose. It felt like the system was designed to keep people like her from getting help. By 7 o'clock, she had gotten the older children ready for school and walked them to the bus stop. David had finally fallen asleep in her arms, exhausted from crying. She knew he would wake up in a few hours hungry again, and she still wouldn't have anything to give him. Standing at the bus stop with the other parents, Keisha felt completely alone. These were good people, but most of them seemed to have their lives together in ways she couldn't manage. Their children had proper backpacks and lunch money. She overheard one mother talking about her child's soccer practice, and another discussing a family vacation. Meanwhile, Keisha was calculating whether she could afford the bus fare to get to work. After the school bus pulled away, she walked back to the apartment with David sleeping against her shoulder. She had 4 hours before she needed to leave for her afternoon shift at the office building, 4 hours to figure out how to feed her baby. She tried calling the formula company to see if they had any sample programs, but after being on hold for 30 minutes, she gave up. She searched online for local charities, but most required appointments or had waiting lists. She even considered calling the children's father, but he had made it clear 3 years ago that he wanted nothing to do with his responsibilities. As the morning dragged on, David woke up crying again. Keisha tried everything she could think of. She gave him tiny spoonfuls of the children's cereal mixed with water, but he couldn't keep it down. She tried mashing up some of the crackers, but that didn't work either. Watching her baby cry from hunger while she stood there helpless was the worst feeling she had ever experienced. At noon, she called her supervisor and told him she was sick and couldn't come to work. She hated lying, but she couldn't leave David with the babysitter when he was crying constantly from hunger. Missing work meant losing money she desperately needed, but what choice did she have? By 2 o'clock, David had been crying for most of the day. Keisha was exhausted and desperate. She looked at the bus route map on her phone and saw that there was a large grocery store about 20 minutes away. She knew they had formula there. She also knew she didn't have money to buy it. The thought that entered her mind scared her. She had never stolen anything in her life. She had been raised to believe that no matter how hard things got, you always found an honest way to survive. But sitting there holding her crying baby, she started to wonder if sometimes there just wasn't an honest way. She spent the next hour trying to think of alternatives. She called everyone she could think of, but no one answered or no one could help. She looked through every corner of the apartment hoping to find some money she had forgotten about, but there was nothing. As David's cries grew weaker, Keisha realized he was getting dehydrated. The fear that something might happen to her baby because she couldn't provide for him was overwhelming. She had always been the type of person who found a way to solve problems, but this problem seemed impossible to solve the right way. At 4 o'clock, she made a decision that would change everything. She put David in his stroller, grabbed her purse, and headed for the bus stop. Her hands were shaking as she waited for the bus, and her heart was beating so fast she could hear it in her ears. During the 20-minute bus ride, she kept telling herself she would find another solution once she got to the store. Maybe she could ask the manager for help, or perhaps there would be someone there who could loan her the money. But deep down she knew that if those options didn't work, she was prepared to do something she never thought she would do. The grocery store was busy with the afternoon crowd when she arrived. She walked to the baby section and stood in front of the formula display. David finally quiet in his stroller. The small container of formula cost $18. She held it in her hands, feeling its weight, knowing it could solve her immediate problem but potentially create much bigger ones. The security guard's hand on her shoulder felt heavier than anything Keisha had ever experienced. She had made it all the way to the parking lot before he caught up with her. The small container of formula and package of diapers were still in her purse, and David was sleeping peacefully in his stroller, unaware that his mother's world was crashing down around them. "Ma'am, I need you to come back inside with me," the guard said. His voice wasn't mean, but it wasn't kind either. It was just business. Keisha's legs felt like they might give out underneath her. She had spent so many sleepless nights imagining worst-case scenarios, but somehow this possibility had never really seemed real. She was a good person. She worked hard. She paid her taxes. She volunteered at her children's school when she could. Good people didn't get arrested for stealing baby formula, did they? The walk back into the store felt like it took forever. Other customers stared as the security guard escorted her to a small office near the customer service counter. Some looked curious, others looked judgmental, and a few looked sympathetic. Keisha kept her eyes on the floor and focused on putting one foot in front of the other. The store manager was a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Patterson who looked like she had dealt with this situation many times before. She wasn't cruel, but she was matter-of-fact as she explained that they would need to call the police and that Keisha would receive a citation for shoplifting. "The items you took total $47.83, Mrs. Patterson said, writing the amount on a form. "Since it's under $50, it's considered petty theft. You'll get a court date and need to appear before the magistrate." Keisha nodded, not trusting her voice to work properly. She thought about Lisa and Tommy, who would be getting home from school soon and expecting her to be there. She thought about her job and whether her supervisor would fire her when he found out. She thought about how she would explain this to her children. The police officer who arrived was younger than Keisha expected. He looked uncomfortable as he filled out the paperwork, glancing occasionally at David sleeping in the stroller. When he handed her the citation, he spoke quietly. "Ma'am, I have to ask you not to return to this store. Your court date is written right there on the paper. Make sure you show up, okay? If you don't appear, they'll issue a warrant for your arrest." Keisha looked down at the citation. The court date was 3 weeks away on a Thursday morning at 9 o'clock. She would have to miss work again, which meant losing more money she couldn't afford to lose. The bus ride home was a blur. David woke up crying again, and she had nothing to give him. The store had kept the formula and diapers as evidence, so she was back where she started. Except now she also had a criminal charge hanging over her head. When Lisa and Tommy got home from school that afternoon, Keisha tried to act normal. She made them a snack from the few crackers left in the cabinet and helped Tommy with his homework while Lisa played with David. but she couldn't concentrate on anything. Every few minutes she would touch the citation in her pocket to make sure it was real. That evening, after the children were asleep, Keisha sat at her kitchen table and tried to figure out what to do next. She looked up information about petty theft charges online and discovered that she could face fines of up to $1,000, possible jail time, and a permanent criminal record. The thought of having a criminal record terrified her. How would she find better work if background checks showed she was a thief? She also learned that she had the right to an attorney, but if she couldn't afford one, she would have to represent herself. The idea of standing in front of a judge and trying to explain her actions seemed impossible. What could she possibly say that would make any difference? Over the next 3 weeks, Keisha tried to prepare for court while dealing with the ongoing crisis at home. She managed to get some formula from the food bank, but it was never enough. She worked extra shifts whenever possible, but the stress was affecting her performance at both jobs. She was constantly tired, constantly worried, and constantly afraid. She researched the magistrate who would hear her case. Judge William Crawford had been on the bench for 15 years and had a reputation for being fair but strict. The news articles she found suggested he didn't have much patience for excuses, but he also wasn't known for giving harsh sentences to first-time offenders. The night before her court date, Keisha couldn't sleep. She had arranged for her neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, to watch the children while she went to court. Mrs. Rodriguez was kind and had offered to help without asking too many questions. But Keisha knew she was curious about why her neighbor needed to go to court on a Thursday morning. Keisha had decided to plead guilty. She couldn't afford a lawyer and she couldn't deny what she had done. The security cameras had caught everything. Her plan was to be honest, accept responsibility, and hope the judge would be lenient since it was her first offense. She arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early, hoping to get a sense of how things worked. The building was imposing, with tall columns and marble floors that echoed with every footstep. She found the right courtroom and sat in the back row, watching other cases being heard before hers. Most of the cases seemed routine. Traffic violations, minor disputes, small claims issues. The judge moved through them efficiently, rarely spending more than a few minutes on each case. When defendants tried to give long explanations, he often cut them off and asked them to just state their plea. As her case got closer, Keisha's palms began to sweat. She watched other defendants approach the podium where they stood to address the judge. Some had lawyers with them, but many were representing themselves just like she would be. The prosecutor, a serious-looking woman in her 40s, seemed to have a standard speech for each type of case. When the clerk called Keisha Johnson versus the state, her heart nearly stopped. She stood up on shaky legs and walked to the front of the courtroom. Judge Crawford looked down at her from his elevated bench, and she felt very small standing there. "Ms. Johnson, you are charged with shoplifting merchandise valued at $47.83 from Patterson's grocery store. How do you plead?" The courtroom was quiet except for the sound of papers rustling and someone coughing in the back row. Keisha looked up at the judge, then at the prosecutor, then back at the judge. Her mouth felt dry, and she could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. "Guilty, Your Honor," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The prosecutor stood up and began her standard presentation. She described the facts of the case, noting that Keisha had been caught leaving the store with unpaid merchandise concealed in her purse. She mentioned that this was Keisha's first offense, but emphasized that shoplifting affected businesses and ultimately raised prices for other customers. The state recommends a fine of $300 plus court costs, 30 hours of community service, and 6 months probation, the prosecutor concluded. Judge Crawford nodded and made some notes on his papers. Keisha stood there waiting, wondering if this was the part where she would be led away in handcuffs. She thought about David at home with Mrs. Rodriguez, probably crying because it was almost time for his morning feeding. "Ms. Johnson," the judge said, looking up from his papers. "Before I impose sentence, is there anything you would like to say to the court?" This was the moment Keisha had been dreading. She had practiced different speeches in her head, but standing there under the judge's gaze, all her prepared words disappeared. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out at first. "Your Honor," she finally managed, "I know what I did was wrong. I've never stolen anything in my life, and I know that's no excuse. She paused, trying to find the right words. "I have a 10-month-old baby at home, and I didn't have money for formula." He hadn't eaten all day and I didn't know what else to do. The courtroom was completely silent. Judge Crawford was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. The prosecutor was shuffling through her papers and the clerk had stopped typing. "I'm not asking you to excuse what I did," Keisha continued, her voice getting stronger. "I know I broke the law and I'm ready to accept whatever punishment you think is fair. I just want you to know that I'm not a bad person. I'm just a mother who made a terrible mistake because I didn't know how else to feed my child." The silence in the courtroom stretched on for what felt like forever. Judge Crawford was staring down at Keisha with an expression that was impossible to read. She stood there feeling exposed and vulnerable, wondering if she had made things worse by trying to explain herself. Maybe judges didn't want to hear sob stories. Maybe she should have just kept quiet and accepted whatever sentence he was going to give her. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of reaching for his gavel or announcing her sentence, Judge Crawford leaned forward in his chair and spoke in a voice that was different from the formal tone he had been using all morning. "Ms. Johnson, I want you to tell me more about your situation at home. You mentioned you have a 10-month-old baby. Are there other children?" The prosecutor looked surprised and started to object, but the judge held up his hand to stop her. Keisha wasn't sure what was happening, but she sensed that this was important. "Yes, sir. I have 3 children. David is the baby, and then I have Lisa, who's 8, and Tommy, who's 6. "And you're raising them by yourself?" "Yes, sir. Their father left when David was born. It's just been me and the kids for 3 years now." Judge Crawford nodded slowly. "What kind of work do you do, Ms. Johnson?" "I clean offices downtown during the week, and I clean houses on the weekends. I work 7 days a week, but it's still not enough to cover everything." The courtroom was still completely quiet, but now it felt different. People were leaning forward in their seats, listening intently to the conversation. Even the prosecutor seemed curious about where this was going. "Have you applied for government assistance?" the judge asked. Keisha felt her cheeks getting warm. She had always been proud of trying to make it on her own. But standing there in front of all these people, she realized how foolish that pride might have been. "Yes, sir. I applied about 2 months ago, but they keep asking for more paperwork. Every time I go down there, they tell me I need something else. And every time I take off work to go to their office, I lose money I can't afford to lose." Judge Crawford was taking notes now, which seemed unusual. Keisha had watched the other cases before hers, and she didn't remember him taking notes during any of those proceedings. "Tell me about the day you took the formula and diapers. What led up to that decision?" This was the hardest part. Keisha had to relive that awful day when she felt like she had run out of options. She told him about David crying all morning because there was no formula. She described trying to feed him watered-down cereal and watching him get sicker. She explained how she had called everyone she could think of, but nobody could help. "I sat there holding my baby while he cried from hunger, and I felt like the worst mother in the world," she said, her voice breaking. "I had never even thought about stealing anything before that day. But I kept thinking, what kind of mother lets her child starve when there's food right there in the store?" As she spoke, Keisha noticed something happening in the courtroom. The people in the gallery weren't looking at her with judgment anymore. Some of them looked sympathetic, and a few women were wiping their eyes. Even the stern-looking prosecutor seemed to be softening. Judge Crawford set down his pen and looked directly at her. "Ms. Johnson, after you took those items from the store, what happened when you got home?" "I never made it home, sir. The security guard stopped me in the parking lot. So David still didn't get to eat that day. Mrs. Rodriguez, my neighbor, she gave me a little bit of formula later, but not enough. He cried most of the night. And how are things now?" "Is David getting enough to eat?" "We're managing day by day. The food bank helped some, and I've been working extra hours when I can, but it's still really hard. Some days are better than others." Judge Crawford was quiet for a long moment, and Keisha could see him thinking. She wondered if she had said too much, if her honesty was going to result in a harsher sentence. Maybe judges didn't care about the reasons people broke the law. Maybe they just cared about the fact that laws were broken. But then the judge surprised her again. "Ms. Johnson, I've been on this bench for 15 years, and I've seen thousands of cases come through this courtroom. I've learned that there's usually a big difference between people who steal because they're greedy and people who steal because they're desperate. Can you help me understand which category you fall into?" Keisha wasn't sure how to answer that question. She had never thought about it in those terms before. "Your Honor, I don't think I'm a greedy person. I've always worked for everything I have, even when it wasn't very much. I've never wanted anything fancy or expensive. That day at the store, I wasn't thinking about getting something for free. I was just thinking about feeding my baby. I would have gladly paid for that formula if I had the money. Have you stolen anything since that day? No, sir. Never. If you were in the same situation again tomorrow with a hungry baby and no money, what would you do differently? That was a hard question because Keisha wasn't sure she would do anything differently. She had tried every legitimate option she could think of before resorting to theft, but she also knew that wasn't the answer the judge wanted to hear. I hope I would find another way, sir. Maybe I would go to more churches or ask more people for help. Maybe I would swallow my pride and ask for help sooner instead of trying to handle everything by myself. Judge Crawford nodded. Pride can be a dangerous thing, can't it? It can keep us from getting help when we need it most. Yes, sir. I think that's true. The judge turned to the prosecutor. Ms. Williams, I'd like to take a short recess to review some things. Can you give me 10 minutes? The prosecutor looked confused but agreed. Judge Crawford stood up and left the courtroom through a door behind his bench. Everyone else remained seated, but people started whispering to each other. Keisha stayed at the podium, not sure if she was supposed to sit down or stay where she was. The court clerk, an older woman with kind eyes, leaned over and whispered, "You can sit down, honey. He'll be back in a few minutes." Keisha returned to her seat in the front row, her legs feeling wobbly. She had no idea what was happening or what the judge was thinking. In all her research about court procedures, she had never read about judges taking recesses in the middle of simple shoplifting cases. The 10 minutes felt like an hour. Keisha kept checking the clock on the wall and wondering if she should call Mrs. Rodriguez to check on the children. She also wondered if this delay was good news or bad news. Maybe the judge was back there deciding to give her jail time after all. When Judge Crawford returned to the courtroom, he looked different somehow. More relaxed, maybe, or more determined. He sat down at his bench and shuffled through some papers before looking up at Keisha. "Ms. Johnson, please approach the bench." Keisha walked back to the podium on unsteady legs. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone in the courtroom could hear it. "I've been thinking about everything you've told me this morning," the judge said. "And I've been thinking about the purpose of our justice system. We're supposed to punish people who break the law, yes, but we're also supposed to protect society and help prevent future crimes. In your case, I'm not convinced that traditional punishment would serve any of those purposes." Keisha wasn't sure what he meant, but something in his tone made her feel like maybe, just maybe, this wasn't going to end the way she had expected. Judge Crawford reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. The entire courtroom watched in stunned silence as he opened it and began counting out bills. Keisha stood frozen at the podium, not understanding what was happening. "The total value of the items you attempted to take was $47.83, the judge said, placing the money on his desk. "I'm going to pay this amount to the store as restitution on your behalf." The prosecutor shot to her feet. "Your Honor, I must object. This is highly irregular. We have established procedures for handling restitution in shoplifting cases." Judge Crawford looked at her calmly. "Ms. Williams, as the presiding magistrate in this case, I have discretion in determining appropriate sentences. Please sit down." The prosecutor remained standing for a moment, clearly wanting to argue further, but eventually took her seat. She was shaking her head and making notes furiously on her legal pad. Keisha felt like she might faint. "Your Honor, I don't understand. What does this mean?" "It means, Ms. Johnson, that the store has been made whole. They've received payment for the merchandise. But more importantly, it means we can focus on addressing the real issue here, which isn't your character or your morals. The real issue is that you and your children are living in poverty, and poverty creates impossible situations." The judge stood up and walked around to the front of his bench, something Keisha had never seen a judge do before. He was no longer the intimidating figure in black robes looking down at her from on high. He was just a man talking to her like a human being. "Ms. Johnson, I don't believe putting you in jail would help your children. I don't believe finding you money you don't have would solve anything. And I certainly don't believe giving you a criminal record would make it easier for you to find better employment and get out of the situation that led you here in the first place." Keisha was crying now, but they weren't tears of fear or shame anymore. They were tears of relief and disbelief. She had spent 3 weeks preparing for the worst-case scenario, and instead, this judge was treating her with more kindness than she had experienced in years. "But I don't want you to think I'm just letting you off the hook," Judge Crawford continued. "I'm going to dismiss the charges against you, But I'm also going to connect you with some resources that might help prevent you from ending up in this situation again." He walked over to the court clerk and asked her to bring him a folder. When she handed it to him, he pulled out several pamphlets and forms. "This is information about emergency assistance programs that can help you right away, not the complicated government programs with all the paperwork. These are local charities and churches that can provide food and formula immediately. This one here," he said, pointing to a blue pamphlet. "They deliver groceries directly to your home so you don't have to take time off work to pick them up." Keisha took the pamphlets with trembling hands. She had never heard of most of these organizations, even though she had been struggling for years. "This form," the judge continued, "is an application for a job training program that provides childcare while you attend classes. They specialize in helping single mothers develop skills for better-paying jobs. The program includes guaranteed job placement when you complete the training." "Your Honor," Keisha said, her voice barely working. "Why are you doing this for me?" Judge Crawford was quiet for a moment. "Ms. Johnson, I became a judge because I believe in justice. But I've learned that sometimes justice means more than just following the letter of the law. Sometimes it means looking at the whole situation and asking what would actually make things better." He walked back to his desk and picked up a business card. "This is the card for a social worker named Janet Rodriguez, who works specifically with families in crisis. I'm going to call her this afternoon and ask her to contact you within the next 2 days. She can help you navigate all these programs and make sure you get the assistance you're entitled to." The courtroom was so quiet you could hear people breathing. Everyone was staring at this unprecedented scene unfolding before them. Some people were crying, others were smiling, and a few were taking pictures with their phones. "Now," Judge Crawford said, returning to his official tone, "I'm going to make this order official. The charges against Keisha Johnson are hereby dismissed. The court finds that the interests of justice are better served by addressing the underlying causes of this incident rather than imposing punitive measures." He banged his gavel, and suddenly the spell was broken. People in the gallery started talking excitedly, and several came forward to congratulate Keisha. The prosecutor gathered her papers with obvious disapproval and left quickly, but many others stayed to witness what happened next. A woman from the third row approached Keisha with tears in her eyes. "Honey, I'm a grandmother myself, and I want you to know that what happened here today gives me hope. You're going to be okay." An older man in a suit introduced himself as a local pastor. "My church runs one of the food programs the judge mentioned. Here's my card. Call me tomorrow and we'll make sure your family has groceries this week." Judge Crawford was still standing near his bench, watching the interactions with a satisfied smile. He seemed genuinely happy about what had just transpired, as if helping Keisha had made his day better rather than more complicated. As the crowd began to thin out, the judge approached Keisha one more time. "Ms. Johnson, I want you to promise me something. I want you to promise that you'll follow up with these resources I've given you. Don't let pride keep you from getting help anymore, okay? Your children need their mother to be strong and healthy, and sometimes that means accepting help from others. I promise, Your Honor. I don't know how to thank you for what you've done today. You can thank me by taking good care of those children and by helping other people when you're in a position to do so someday. What happened here today doesn't end with you walking out of this courtroom. It's the beginning of something better for your family." As Keisha gathered the pamphlets and forms the judge had given her, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Real, genuine hope that things could actually get better. The court clerk handed her a copy of the dismissal order and whispered, "That man has been a judge for 15 years, and I've never seen him do anything like what he did for you today. You must have really touched his heart." Outside the courthouse, Keisha sat on the steps for a few minutes trying to process everything that had just happened. 3 hours ago, she had walked into that building expecting to be fined, sentenced to community service, and saddled with a criminal record. Instead, she was walking out with resources that could actually change her family's life. She pulled out her phone to call Mrs. Rodriguez and let her know she was on her way home. But first, she looked at the business card Judge Crawford had given her. Janet Rodriguez, Social Services Coordinator. She decided to call that number before she even got home. When Janet answered, Keisha explained who she was and what had just happened in court. Janet's response was immediate and enthusiastic. "Judge Crawford called me about an hour ago and told me to expect your call. I've already started pulling together some resources for you. Can you meet me tomorrow morning?" I think we can get your family signed up for emergency assistance by the end of the week." As Keisha rode the bus home, she looked out the window at the city passing by. Everything looked the same as it had that morning, but somehow everything felt different. For the first time in 3 years, she felt like she wasn't completely alone in trying to take care of her children. When she walked into her apartment, David was sleeping peacefully in Mrs. Rodriguez's arms, and Lisa and Tommy were doing their homework at the kitchen table. They looked up at her with anxious faces, clearly worried about where their mother had been all morning. "How did it go, Mama?" Lisa asked quietly. Keisha sat down at the table and pulled both older children into a hug. "It went better than I ever could have imagined, baby. Much, much better." 3 days after her court appearance, Keisha's phone rang while she was getting the children ready for school. The number looked familiar, but she couldn't place it until she answered. "Ms. Johnson, this is Janet Rodriguez from Social Services. We spoke after your court hearing. I have some wonderful news for you." Keisha sat down at the kitchen table, her heart racing. In the past 3 days, so many good things had happened that she was almost afraid to believe her luck could continue. "The emergency assistance came through faster than I expected," Janet continued. "You'll be receiving grocery vouchers worth $200 this week, and I've arranged for formula and diapers to be delivered to your apartment every month for the next 6 months." Keisha started crying right there at the breakfast table. Lisa looked over with concern, but Keisha gave her a thumbs up to let her know these were happy tears. "That's not all," Janet said. "I spoke with the director of the job training program Judge Crawford mentioned. They have an opening in their next class, which starts Monday. It's a 12-week program for medical office administration, and they guarantee job placement with benefits at the end." "Monday? That's so soon. What about childcare?" "That's included in the program. They provide full childcare for all participants, including infant care for David. And here's the best part. They pay you a small stipend while you're in training, so you won't lose income by leaving your current jobs." After she hung up with Janet, Keisha sat in her kitchen feeling overwhelmed by gratitude. A week ago, she had been desperate and hopeless. Now she had food security, educational opportunities, and a path toward a better future for her children. But she had no idea that her story was about to reach far beyond her small apartment. That same morning, Rebecca Walsh, a reporter for the local newspaper, was having coffee with her friend who worked as a court stenographer. Her friend was telling her about the most unusual court proceedings she had ever witnessed. "Rebecca, you should have seen it. This judge literally pulled money out of his own wallet to pay restitution for a woman who stole baby formula. Then he spent 20 minutes connecting her with social services. I've been working in that courthouse for 8 years, and I've never seen anything like it." Rebecca was intrigued. As a journalist who had covered dozens of routine court cases, she knew this was something special. She spent the rest of the morning researching Judge Crawford's background and trying to contact people who had witnessed the hearing. By noon, she had tracked down 3 people who had been in the courtroom that day, and their accounts were consistent. Judge Crawford had not only dismissed the charges but had personally paid the restitution and provided extensive resources to help the defendant get back on her feet. Rebecca called the courthouse to request an interview with Judge Crawford, but he initially declined. He told her that he had simply done what he felt was right and didn't think it deserved special attention. "Judge Crawford," Rebecca said during their phone conversation, "with respect, what you did goes far beyond the normal scope of judicial proceedings. Don't you think people might be inspired by hearing about this approach to justice?" After thinking it over for a day, Judge Crawford agreed to a brief interview, with the condition that the focus remain on the principles involved rather than on him personally. The newspaper article appeared on the front page of the Metro section 3 days later. Under the headline, "Local Judge Shows Mercy, Changes Life." Rebecca had interviewed Judge Crawford, court personnel, and several people who had witnessed the proceedings. She had also spoken with Keisha, who had agreed to share her story in hopes that it might help other families in similar situations. The article described Keisha's desperate circumstances, her difficult decision to steal formula, and Judge Crawford's unprecedented response. It quoted the judge explaining his philosophy. "Sometimes the most effective way to prevent future crimes is to address the conditions that created the desperate situation in the first place." The response to the article was immediate and overwhelming. The newspaper's phone lines were flooded with calls from readers who wanted to help families like Keisha's. Local churches reported increased donations to their food banks. The job training program mentioned in the article received dozens of inquiries from both potential students and employers wanting to participate. But the story didn't stop with the local newspaper. Social media users began sharing the article with comments like, "This is what real justice looks like," and, finally, "A judge who understands that poverty isn't a crime." Within a week, the story had been picked up by regional newspapers and eventually by national news outlets. Judge Crawford found himself fielding interview requests from across the country. Legal scholars began writing articles about restorative justice and the role of discretion in judicial proceedings. Law schools started using the case as an example of innovative approaches to criminal justice. Meanwhile, Keisha was experiencing her own transformation. The job training program was challenging but rewarding. She was learning computer skills, medical terminology, and office procedures that would qualify her for positions paying nearly twice what she had been earning as a cleaner. The childcare at the training center was excellent, and David was thriving in the stimulating environment. Lisa and Tommy were doing better in school now that they weren't constantly worried about whether there would be food at home. For the first time in years, Keisha felt like she could plan for the future, instead of just surviving day by day. 2 months after her court appearance, Keisha received an unexpected phone call from a television producer who had read about her story online. The producer was working on a documentary about innovative approaches to criminal justice and wanted to feature Judge Crawford's decision as a central example. "We'd like to interview both you and Judge Crawford," the producer explained. "We think your story illustrates something important about how the justice system could work differently." Keisha was hesitant at first. She had never been comfortable with attention, and she worried about her children's privacy. But when she discussed it with Judge Crawford, he encouraged her to participate. "Your story has already helped so many people," he told her during a phone call. "If sharing it more widely can help reform the system and prevent other families from going through what you went through, isn't that worth considering?" The documentary, titled Beyond Punishment: A New Model for Justice, aired 6 months later and won several awards. It featured interviews with Keisha, Judge Crawford, and experts in criminal justice reform. The film showed Keisha at her graduation from the job training program, starting her new position at a pediatric clinic, and living in the larger apartment she had been able to afford with her increased income. But perhaps the most powerful moment in the documentary was when Keisha returned to Judge Crawford's courtroom, not as a defendant but as an observer. She wanted to see if his approach to her case had been an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern. What she witnessed that day was a courtroom transformed. Judge Crawford was still handling cases with efficiency and fairness, but there was something different in his approach. He was asking more questions about defendants' circumstances. He was connecting people with social services more frequently. He was looking for creative solutions that addressed underlying problems, rather than just imposing standard penalties. After court that day, Judge Crawford and Keisha spoke privately in his chambers. "Your case changed me too," he admitted. "It reminded me why I became a judge in the first place. It's not just about applying the law mechanically. It's about finding ways to make society better and safer for everyone." Keisha looked around the judge's office, taking in the law books and certificates on the walls. "Your Honor, I need to tell you something. That day in your courtroom wasn't just about the formula and diapers. It was about dignity. You treated me like a human being worth helping instead of just a criminal to be punished. That changed how I see myself." "And how do you see yourself now?" "I see myself as someone who made a mistake during the worst time in her life, but who is capable of much more than just surviving. I see myself as someone who can contribute to society and help other people. I see myself as someone whose children can be proud of." The ripple effects of Judge Crawford's decision continued to spread. Other judges began adopting similar approaches in their courtrooms. Law schools started offering courses on restorative justice. Social service agencies reported increased funding from donors who had been inspired by the story. A year after her court appearance, Keisha was promoted to supervisor at the medical clinic where she worked. She was earning enough money to move her family to a safe neighborhood with good schools. Lisa was excelling in her advanced classes. Tommy had joined the school soccer team, and David was a healthy, happy toddler who would never remember the hungry days of his infancy. But Keisha didn't forget where she had come from. She volunteered at the food bank, that had helped her family during their darkest days. She mentored other single mothers who were struggling with poverty, and she spoke at conferences and community meetings about the importance of addressing root causes rather than just symptoms of social problems. On the first anniversary of her court date, Keisha wrote a letter to Judge Crawford. Dear Judge Crawford, 1 year ago today you changed my family's life forever, but I want you to know that your decision has had effects far beyond what happened to us. I've met dozens of people who have been inspired by your example to help others in their communities. I've heard from other judges who are trying to follow your lead. I've seen how one act of compassion can create waves of positive change that reach places you never expected. Thank you for seeing me as a person worth saving instead of just a case to be processed. Thank you for showing my children that the world has good people in it, who care about doing what's right. And thank you for proving that sometimes the most powerful thing a person in authority can do is choose mercy over punishment. Your decision didn't just help one desperate mother feed her baby. It started a movement toward a more compassionate kind of justice that I believe will help families for years to come. When Judge Crawford received that letter, he kept it in his desk drawer and read it whenever he faced a difficult case that required him to balance justice with compassion. It reminded him that every person who appeared before his bench was someone's child, someone's parent, someone worthy of dignity and hope. And in courtrooms across the country, other judges were learning that sometimes the most just decision is the one that helps people, rather than just punishing them.